Bueno, buenas tardes. Okay, so I'll just get started. Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm very happy to be here. My name is Stephen Kay. I have to issue a disclaimer that these are my views, and I'm going to speak for about 15 minutes, no more, and then turn the floor to my colleague, Federico Mandelman, who will speak about his research. But David Kotak asked me to say a few words about the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta and Latin America, so that's what I'll do. We're very interested in Latin America at the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta. Our core functions are payments, bank supervision, and monetary policy, and we have ties that connects us to Latin America in various ways. And so we started the America Center to make sure that we utilize our resources effectively, that we communicate with one another effectively. We're a very large organization, and so people, as you know, in large organizations, everyone stays in their own silo, and so we want us to collaborate effectively and to communicate with the outside world. So I'm just going to tell you a brief history. It's kind of interesting. To understand the Atlanta Fed's connection to Latin America, you have to go back to the BCCI scandal. And I don't know how many people remember the BCCI scandal, but BCCI there's actually a movie. So you can see the film. There are not a lot of bank stories that have Hollywood films associated with them. This is a rare instance where you can see a Hollywood film and learn about a bank. So this movie came out just 2 years ago with Bryan Cranston. It's called The Infiltrator. So BCCI was a bank founded in 1972. It was based in the Cayman Islands in Luxembourg. It was led by a sheikh from Abu Dhabi, but really it was out of James Bond. It was all kinds of money laundering and terrorist financing, working directly with Pablo Escobar. I mean, you can't make this stuff up. That's why they made a movie, I guess. And so when they came to the U.S., they opened loan offices in New York and California and Florida, but they didn't take deposits. So they were under the radar. They were exempt at the time. I don't know what the regulations are now, but they were exempt from federal regulations. So I'm getting to the Atlanta Fed part, by the way. Oops. When a group of Arab investors sought to buy a U.S. bank called First American Bank shares, the Fed held a hearing in 1981 because they were concerned. They wondered if BCCI was already on the radar. They wondered if BCCI was behind the purchase. And that bank hired Clark Clifford, who was a very esteemed man. He had been a Secretary of Defense. He'd worked with 4 presidents, starting with Franklin Roosevelt, and he represented First American Bank shares, and he assured the Fed that everything was okay. There was no corruption. There was no BCCI connection. As it turns out, BCCI was behind the purchase, and Clark Clifford either didn't know or lied, and it was a sad end to his career, but the sale went through. So BCCI purchased 2 other banks, and when the whole thing blew up, there were $15 billion in liabilities. So in response, Congress decided that the Fed needed to know more about foreign banks in the United States. They passed the Foreign Bank Supervisory Enhancement Act, and that required the Fed to approve permission for foreign banks that are operating in the U.S. They needed to evaluate the extent to which these banks themselves were supervised in their home countries. And the good part for me is they created this Latin America team in Atlanta, and that's how I got my job. So that group was created in 1995. And so the idea is that bank supervisors will now and do now know a lot more about what's going on in their home countries. And in 2005, we decided to centralize all of our Latin America activity under the America Center. So why would we locate the America Center in Atlanta versus somewhere else? Well, of course, the Latin American economies are very important to the U.S. economy. There's significant financial and commercial ties. About half of trade with Latin America goes through Florida ports. So Florida's in our district. It kind of makes sense. Miami is has the second largest concentration of foreign banks in the United States. So that's another reason that we should have an America Center in our district. So we're kind of a logical place. So I'll tell you really, I mentioned this start of the story related to bank supervision. We do supervision, payments, monetary policy. Moving to payments, the Fed's also responsible for the payment system. And in 2001, President George W. Bush and Vicente Fox, and the president of Mexico at the time, started a program called Directo a Mexico, which is a low-cost way to transfer money to Mexico. The concern at the time that was about Mexicans, either immigrants, Mexican Americans, whomever, sending money to Mexico, that if you go through Western Union, it's very expensive, you get a bad exchange rate. So the idea was the Fed can work with the Central Bank of Mexico to set up a payment system. And that system does exist to this day. It's a very, the big, I don't know if it's a flaw, but the reason why the system, why more people don't use it is you have to walk into a bank in the United States, and to receive the money in Mexico, you have to have a bank account. So that eliminates a lot, for a lot of people, it's very unattractive. In earlier times, non-citizens in the United States could go to the Mexican consulate and get a cédula consular, which was a sufficient document to open a bank account. Things have changed, and it's no longer quite so easy to do that. So, so that's our payment system. Very briefly, we started a Cuba Initiative a number of years ago when we thought, let's think about how changes in Cuba could affect the economies of our district, how it could affect the work of the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta. So when the US and Cuba resumed diplomatic ties in 2014, we were ready. And we have had contact with our colleagues at the central bank in Cuba, but that's, as you can imagine, is on hold. We very recently, with the GIC, just 2 weeks ago in Sarasota, Florida, we did a program on Cuba and the Caribbean. So Cuba is an area of great interest. And I thought it might be of interest for people to know that the Atlanta Fed actually had a branch in Havana. We had our own branch from 1923 to 1938. The Boston Fed also had a branch there in 1923 to 1927. On 3 occasions, the Atlanta Fed came to the rescue when there were bank runs and quickly moved cash down and sort of saved the day and stopped the bank run. There was actually a big scandal. Those were prohibition times. And in one of those cases, the Atlanta Fed it was a Friday afternoon, they got the call. I'm just picturing it sort of cinematically. They said, okay, they need us. They got together $26.5 million. They put it on a train. The train went to South Florida. And then the money got transferred to a Cuban gunboat. And it got to Havana Sunday night in time for the banks to open on Monday morning. So it was a heroic story, except the Fed official on the train, there were a bunch of Fed officials. And after the whole rescue, they were accused of being drunk and dishonoring the reputation of the Atlanta Fed. And the Atlanta Fed said, no, that's not true. The thought was the Boston Fed was behind all this. And no, this is true. I'm not making this up. And selling the reputation of their Atlanta colleagues, and the Atlanta Fed insisted no. And the Atlanta Fed did its own investigation and concluded that, yes, this official, his name was Joseph L. Campbell, that he had had 2 glasses of wine, but he was not drunk. But nevertheless, he lost his job. So anyway, I digress, but it's a great story, and it's one of the worst scandals. And if that's the worst scandal the Atlanta Fed has, well, I think we'll take it. We were in that building on the 2nd floor in Havana. And just currently we're starting a project on de-risking in the Caribbean. The Caribbean's been hardest hit among all the regions of the globe in terms of the decline in correspondent banking relationships. A lot of banks have decided it's just not worth. They're concerned about money laundering, supervision, and they've cut off ties with banks in the Caribbean. And so we're convening some researchers to look at the scope of that problem. And that kind of goes back to our origins, really, with the BCCI and concerns about money laundering. So that's a project we're working on right now. And this is really a very brief introduction to the America Center, why the Atlanta Fed has an America Center. Please ask me any questions. But I don't want to take up any more of your time. I want to cede the microphone to my colleague Federico. So thank you very much.